Reunifications make us all feel good. I mean, it's really extraordinary to watch that, and you're so happy for that family. But there's still thousands of kids who are separated and who don't know.
And they won't tell us how many. This is the heartlessness. Still
see everything that senators want to see, who have oversight of this, that journalists want to see, who have an obligation. Is there a concern about, we need to be careful about feeling too warm and fuzzy when we see one of these reunions?
Oh, I mean, I think seeing the reunions is obviously a wonderful thing, both for the family and for the country, because it reminds you what the moral stakes of this are. And I think nobody looks at that without thinking of the 2,000 children who are still in camps, incarcerated ostensibly, with no idea when they're going to meet family members. And some, as Maria was saying, family members already having been deported. So there's really no ability to make that happen. The callousness and heartlessness of the Trump administration, when we saw Health and Human Services arguing with the Department of Homeland Security over who was in charge of the reunification plan, and it became clear that there was no plan and no one in charge, the idea that Republicans are going to run on this as somehow border security, when what we are talking about is indefinite family detention and the separation of children as young as babies, I think Americans can see straight through that. What we're talking about is, what kind of a country are we? What is our moral obligation to the people who come here, as promised, to a country that takes care of the world's refugees? We're not living up to that promise at all.
One side, you have that very real argument and conversation about who are we as Americans. You know, when I go downtown, I see the Statue of Liberty, I think about my grandfather coming across on a boat from Hungary all those years ago, 1898. But Evan, there is also a conversation to be had about border security. And I think when you talk about some of the people in the middle in particular, they have those concerns. We learned last night the number of border arrests were down in June, the first time that has happened in 4 months. Does that give President Trump ammunition to say, look, this is working, this program that we have, this tough new border plan is working? Or does it undercut his argument, we're being overrun by immigrants and they're causing, you know, potentially you not to be safe in your home?
Well, I think President Trump's base will buy whatever he says. Facts can sometimes be stubborn things, and they view them as false, and they'll buy into whatever facts they want to believe in. The president said about a year ago that illegal border crossings since he came in office were down 60%. Then he went close to 80%, another thing. And he and Vice President Pence in April were saying 40%. And then the RNC the following week sent out an email saying, oh, illegal border crossings are surging. This is terrible. And Democrats don't want to do anything about it. And then the following week, the RNC sent out a talking point saying President Trump has solved the border crisis. There's no real messaging plan. Nobody's syncing up. So I don't know what they're doing. I think when we talk about border crossings, we really haven't talked about the real issue, which is visa overstays. 2/3 of all illegal immigrants who came to the United States came from 2014 on in visa overstays. They enter legally, and the president doesn't address it. And I think Democrats would be very smart to hammer the president on that point and say, if you're serious about immigration, get serious on visa overstays.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.